Hello and welcome to this edition of ZOUD, Zone of Uncomfortable Debate. Now, you may have been seeing some of our past podcasts that we are demonstrating what it can feel like and look like to have open, honest discussions about situations and circumstances, issues that can play out in the workplace and in society as a whole. You know, one of my previous senior leaders from another company used to say to me, Sylvia, it's about either drinking your own champagne or eating your own dog food. And I believe today we are going to be drinking our own champagne as I have invited a number of our executive board and an external guest to sit in the hot seat with the C-suite. I think it's going to be a very rich, a really great debate today. And we're going to be focusing on the diversity agenda and whether or not our senior leaders are really serious about transforming and removing those systemic barriers, or is it lip service? We'll see. So joining me for this great debate, I'm really pleased. It's an absolute honor, actually, to be inviting our CEO, Andrew Catto, and also our Chief Financial Officer, David Baines. Welcome, David and Andrew.
Nice to be here. Thanks very much for the invitation and thanks for convening this really important meeting, Sylvia.
Thanks, Andrew. And then I want to introduce, you've seen her before, actually. She was quite a hit, I think, in our last podcast where we talked about menopause or men on pause. She's our Chief Strategy and Transformation Officer, the very one and only Catherine Pitts. Catherine, welcome and thanks again for joining ZOUD.
Sylvia, I'm really looking forward to today, and I'm sure what will be a very lively discussion between our exec members, if not Gifford as well. So thank you.
Oh yeah, thank you. I'm looking forward to it as well. And then I want to introduce Dr. Gifford Ramey. Now, Dr. Gifford is not a stranger to IC24. In fact, he has been with us on the journey since last year. And I couldn't think of a better person, a critical companion who's going to be coming to also help uncover this discussion and help us to see it from different points of view. We want to welcome Dr. Gifford Ramey. Dr. Gifford, thank you so much for joining.
My utmost pleasure, Sylvia, and kudos to IC24 for actually not just talking about this within, but talking about it without, to actually show that this kind of work can be done and is valued.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gifford. So we're talking about being in the hot seat with the C-suite, and I think that it can be really easy to criticize our leaders and to say they don't understand and, you know, what's happening. And certainly in the diversity agenda, it is a very long and can sometimes feel like a very slow process. You know, according to a CEO survey published by PricewaterhouseCoopers UK, it says that nearly 9 out of 10 businesses said that they promote diversity and inclusion within their organizations. Now, the commitment is even higher when you look across other sectors, such as the healthcare is at 91%, power and utilities at 90%, insurance at 94%. So we know that diversity, in terms of it being important, is looking like it's, you know, it's really been embraced and agreed by the organizations. So if we all agree that diversity, inclusion, equity is important, why is it that it feels like sometimes we're not really seeing the fruits of that promotion, that importance? What's happening? And we could stand here and guess, or we could ask the people that are in the decision-making seats who can help us to uncover some of this. So I want to go and focus first foremost on IC24, which is the organization that I work for and where we introduced our CEO, our Chief Financial Officer, and our Chief Strategy and Transformation Officers. And I want to just focus on our D&I journey so far and to hear it from our very own CEO's mouth in terms of what the journey has been like. So Andrew, can you tell us about the start of diversity, equity and inclusion at IC24? You know, what were the intentions and motives behind even investing in this type of initiative?
Yeah, thank you, Sylvia. That's a pretty fundamental question, isn't it, to address? And I suppose maybe just before we do that, I'd like to maybe go back and explore my own values and beliefs in this particular space. And people who know anything about IC24 and its leadership, I'm a medically qualified chief exec. I've been with IC24 for 6 years, but I was a senior NHS leader before that. I worked in a variety of organisations, and I've had a long-standing interest in actually how we diversify our workforce. And some examples of that, even, you know, long before I came to NHS, were to IC24, my examples from NHS practice, particularly around engaging senior female leaders in roles that traditionally were undertaken by doctors, whether it's a nurse consultant in stroke medicine or whether it was senior nurses leading on a DVT service. I've always realised the benefits of challenging those traditional workforce models, and as a doctor, we tend, I think, and even to this day, I think colleagues may agree or disagree, but you know, we still have quite a doctor-centric view in terms of delivering the workforce. So it's something that I've seen work in practice long actually before I came here, and indeed, as I said, you know, I've actively promoted those things. Returning to the question of IC24, as I said, I've been here for 6 years, but you had the privilege of being the CEO for the last 3. I think the executive leadership team, led by our chief people officer, or led with the support of our chief people officer, Joe Mills, really realised the importance of diversity and inclusion. And the way we approach that, I think, is, again, it links back to something that personally I know works, whether it's in IC24 or indeed in other organisations. And that is, if you're going to bring about real change, and that was your challenge, Sylvia, it has to be led and owned by our colleagues, by our staff. And again, we know that's important, and there's plenty of evidence. Michael West and others, you know, have looked at this over 10 years, and we know happy and engaged staff get the best outcomes for patients. So there's that kind of happy staff, happy patients kind of, you know, maxim that's often used. It's entirely valid in this context. So when we set about that journey, we did so through the formation of these things called colleague resource groups, or CRGs. And you're right, you know, there was a considerable investment of time and indeed some investment of money, but it's principally around the investment of time. This was championed by the executive team, but really importantly, a real key critical success factor, it was championed by the board, and the board, including the chair, have had a lot of oversight in terms of what's going on. So, you know, they've been engaged with the process. And those colleague resource groups, well, clues in the title, Sylvia, really. It was actually made up of our people. And those colleague resource groups, I think, have had really quite a fascinating journey, whether it's cultural inclusion, whether it's brave women, whether it's disability confident, or whether it's LGBTQ+, they've all been on a journey, and I think they've all been on different trajectories. We might have the opportunity to explore and compare and contrast those groups during the course of today's podcast, because some quite clearly have had a stronger, more upward and sustained trajectory than others. And, you know, when you're, again, testing whether we mean it, you know, when people kind of come onto a presentation like this and say, it's all been great, it's worked really well, the chances are people don't believe you. And of course, they'd be right to question it. You know, what I've seen, certainly in the group that I lead, and again, I think when you're testing, you know, are you putting your money where your mouth is? All of these CRGs have actually got an executive sponsor. So I have seen visible and engaged executive leadership, and execs are heading it up. You know, they're being clear on the strategy. They're a little bit like Dynarod, Sylvia. They actually unblock, you know, when things aren't actually working as effectively as they should. But I think what we have seen over the last, you know, 6 to 12 months is the next level down. We've actually seen our senior leaders providing more day-to-day leadership of those CRGs rather than the exec. And as an organization, that's what we're looking to achieve. It's not just about, execs, making all of the decisions. I want to see people at lower levels empowered. And I've certainly seen that. Again, we can maybe come on to this in the conversation, Sylvia, but in my own subgroup of disability confident, I've really seen people owning it, and I've really seen people bringing about tangible changes for people with disability. It's worked, but it's a job it's a work in progress as well. So yes, we've seen some successes, but there's more to do. So I'm genuinely excited about it. I'm genuinely committed to it, and I know my executive colleagues feel the same. But there'll be a chance to explore that, I'm sure, in a minute. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrew. And I can hear your passion. And I should say that when we first started out, Andrew actually stepped forward before he was even asked to be an exec sponsor. He goes, I want to, if there's an opportunity to be the exec sponsor for Disability Confident. And it was really, for me, really powerful to see our own CEO stepping forward, knowing the scale and time that he has for his core role. He really stepped in and is still stepping into this day. So thank you so much. And I'm just going to stay I'm going to go over to Catherine. Now, Catherine, what has been your experience of the IC24 journey when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion?
I think, as Andrew said, it's been quite a journey for us to sort of get everything in place and move ourselves forward. And I think all organisations have a responsibility to do this. But I suppose as an exec of a social enterprise, I think as an executive, you have a huge social responsibility. So I think, as Andrew said, the executive were absolutely, as a team, really behind getting this right. But I suppose personally for me, I've been heading up the cultural inclusion for all. And I'm going to share and be really honest, I felt like an imposter when I started at this CRG, thinking, oh, how am I going to bring authenticity to this role? And really show integrity to the team. So I had to kind of get through some of that, really, of my own sort of thoughts and how I was going to give that positive leadership in that authentic way that also didn't isolate people, and to try and get people to join the cultural inclusion, where I'm sure people look in and think, well, what does she know? How can she really relate to me working in IC24? So it's been quite a battle for me personally to kind of get over that and keep the energy levels high, and not focus on the differences, but more focus on the similarities that we will bring into cultural inclusion for all. So for me, it was quite a personal journey to get that tone of the meeting right and to get that ownership right. There's still a long way to go, and I think certainly in cultural inclusion, I think it's a really difficult cultural dial to shift in an organisation, and it's a really difficult topic. People don't necessarily want to join. A lot of, I've asked people why they're not joining, and they'll say to me, I'm a black man working at IC24, I don't know what you want to talk about. So for me, it's been quite a challenge. So I think we're on the right journey, as Andrew said. And I think all the execs also are coming. I think it's really important with that vulnerability and willingness to share that we don't necessarily come with all those answers either. And therefore, as Andrew said, it's been really important, that engagement across all parts of our organisation to try and get that open and honesty. But you do have to be very willing to share your own vulnerabilities. And that's why Zow's so important, because you can then have the conversation, and as you always remind us, leave everybody whole at the end. So that's kind of my reflections on where we are. I think it's exciting, and I think it's hard to move from the hurrah activities that you can imagine I love into the more day-to-day cultural change. So I think we've still got a long way to go. And I'll always be the one leading the hurrah, the bunting, and the cupcakes.
and the Caribbean food and the
Caribbean food,
all of those hurrah. And I think it's really important what you said there, Catherine, about the vulnerability, because it is about being willing to allow ourselves to be vulnerable so others can actually benefit from that vulnerability and move people on. And that takes courage. So thank you so much for sharing that. That's such a good
just on
point.
that point,
Go on,
Sylvia,
go ahead.
when the execs are leading these things, what you don't want to do is people coming along because of the fear of position power
Yeah.
and therefore driving that conversation. So the exec leadership role is quite a delicate one. As Andrew said, it's run blocking, not necessarily as that you will attend type role.
Yes.
So
Yes.
it's quite important.
And we know that mandating people, you know, there's a story about this little boy that refused to sit down, and his father was just getting frustrated with him. He said, for the last time, sit down. And he said, I'm sitting down, but I'm standing up in my heart. So we don't want people to come out of compliance. We want people to see that this is the right thing to do. And I'm going to ask Professor Gifford, just after I ask David a question about why we might think this cultural inclusion, this race really is what we're talking about, is quite hard. So I'm going to come to David. David, what has been your personal journey of diversity and inclusion in IC24?
Yeah, I think so. When I came to IC24, I think it was noticeable that it had quite a good, at a senior level, had quite a good gender balance, but it was very white, which, to be fair, you know, did represent the area that the head office is based in, but it didn't represent the national position, and it didn't represent our patients. And it's really important. We are here for our patients. We're here to provide a service, and we have to provide a service that is relevant to them. And therefore, something like cultural diversity helps that position. We obviously, I mean, Andrew, you spoke about the disabled aspect of this area, and clearly a lot of our patients are in a position with some form of disability, and therefore it only makes sense that we have to include that type of people. But the same could be argued for ethnicity, for gender, for whatever area there is. So it's important, really important, that as an organisation we don't just pay lip service, because otherwise we're not doing our patients and giving our patients the service that they deserve and need. So from that perspective, I think there's a requirement to do it, but also we're daft if we don't consider it. It's not as though we have a lot of people who want to work in all the areas we would like them to work in at the moment. That might change over time, and has changed since I've been here. But the wider we open ourselves up, the more available we are to and seen as not just saying things but doing things. We can encourage more and more people to come in from lots of different diverse areas that can help our population. So it'll then serve to service those patients that we talked about. I mean, again, we know that there's a lot of problems in disability for people with disabilities to get roles, and actually in some of we've got some ideal roles for those types of people who can then service those patients particularly. So in terms of the journey of how it's changed, I think it's dramatic, and I think there are good reasons from the service and from how, you know, we as individuals and as a company benefit from a different group of employees as well. So I think it's a no-brainer. We have to move down this journey, and a cultural change takes a long time. I think that's another thing we need to be clear on to everybody, that it is a journey, and we're at a very early point in that journey. I heard somewhere that cultural change normally takes about 4 years to embed. So we've got a long way to go down this area and this route, and it will take some time. And so that, I think one thing that worries me a little bit is that people with any form of diversity could look at our leadership group and say, well, you're not very inclusive. And I think they need to understand that, you know, that will take time to change. It will take time to change people within our organisation, but it will occur over time, and it is part of a journey, not an end. We're not at the end of that. We're very much at the beginning of that.
Yeah, thanks. Sorry,
Go ahead.
Come in on a couple of points that sort of both David and Catherine's raised, really, and you picked up on too. Firstly, in relation to the vulnerability, yes, there's vulnerability on the part of leaders. There's also vulnerability on the part of CRG participants, and one of the things that I have to say I found enormously impressive. Quite recently, we held a session of involving colleagues with neurodiversity. And we had, I think, about 4 speakers, internal colleagues in the organisation who would identify themselves as being neurodiverse. And I was on this call, I'm privileged to be on the call, in fact. And these people opened up and explained what it was like to be neurodiverse at IC24. I have a personal family reason for my interest in neurodiversity, but to me, that was incredibly encouraging. We talk a lot about psychologically safe organizations, but the fact that 4 colleagues, and there were senior people on that call, had no concern. Of course they had concern, but they felt it was a sufficiently safe space to say, what was it like to be neurodiverse at IC24? So that's a really good example of the other end of Catherine's telescope. But the other thing, which David again, I think raises a very important point about the diversity of leadership, and I'm sure we're going to come on to that. And there was a genuine commitment to doing it. And I suppose, without wishing to, because I'm cautious not to reveal any confidentiality, but to say on this call, we had a recent senior post shortlisted, and of those candidates, 2 out of the 3 were from ethnically diverse backgrounds. So I think there is definite evidence that those people are shortlisted. So it's not, but we're on that journey. And I think that is it's in a small way, but it's evidence that we're moving in the right way, albeit not as the pace we might all like.
Yeah, and I love that, Andrew. Even just to say that yes, it is this it's the longevity. It's almost like a marathon, and I just want to inspire everyone just to do your lap, run your lap, because actually, we know that we can't do the whole relay, but if I do my lap, and I'm committed to do my lap, then it's going to help me to pass the baton on to somebody else. So I think when we look at the whole diversity journey as a marathon, and it's long and it's difficult, you just want to sit down by the side and say, I can't do it. But if I am committed, I'm going to run my lap and run it well. I think that's where we need to get our mindset. And thank you so much, David, for sharing your initial thoughts and for looking broader at, how we have began that change which is so fundamental in our organization. Professor Gifford, you were baptized into the Black History Month. I believe it was probably 2 years ago. I can't even remember. 2 years or last year, might have been year before. So can you share your views? You've also done some recent work with our board at the Board Development Day. What has been your view when you look at IC24 in terms of our journey and what we are doing as a critical companion?
Yeah, I do remember very vividly the first encounter. It was over Zoom, wasn't it? And I made a presentation, and what was fascinating about that was the array of people that were eager to hear something and to learn something. And that drew me in, to be honest, because as I shared, I felt that I was listening, that I had empathetic listeners, and that doesn't always happen. As you know, I take a very pastoral approach to sharing the diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And I find that in that way, people are able to see that what we are talking about is a human issue. It's very much something that is concerned with relationships and with everyone. In times past, workplaces have taken a very compartmentalized approach to doing to realizing their products, to doing their service. And if you can imagine, not too long ago, say in a health context, we would talk about a doctor being focused on their patients in terms of the outcomes that they want to see. A result is when there is some progress in the healing, if you like, of the patient. And one could be forgiven for thinking that when you're in your white coat, you're basically just focused with the authority that you have to get the desired result. And then, you know, we talk about bedside manners and the cultural interplay and interaction between the doctor and the patients. And this has and it was felt that some people are gifted at it, you know, and they're natural at it, and others are not too gifted at it, and some are fairly unteachable when it comes to that. But the truth of the matter is, what we're realizing is more and more, especially with the Gen Zs and the millennials, people are expecting human-to-human interaction through keen and reciprocal relationships. And this means taking into view the full person that you're dealing with, whether it's a colleague, whether it's a patient, the full person. And the approach that I take is, I'm simply a beggar telling another beggar where to find bread. And it's interesting, Sylvia, your analogy of you know, staying in your lane and doing your lap, and it's almost like a relay. We do our lap, and I really do love that. And I extend that analogy by using the analogy of, I'm just a human telling another human being how we can be better at being human. And because I see diversity, equity, inclusion and belonging not as characteristics. In other words, these are not things that we put on and take off, you know, with our coats or with our uniform. These are actually human qualities that we all have. I actually assume that as human beings, we already have a modicum of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. The problem is that we have been conditioned by society in more ways than one to bury these, to suppress these. And part of our task is to actually get people back in touch with these very basic values, so that we can be better at what we do. So I actually see diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging as values, and as human values, and not as characteristics. And unfortunately, some have been buried so far down that I feel sometimes that I'm an exorcist, that I'm having to do some resurrection rite, you know, to get people really in touch. But be it as it may, I'm prepared to do that. Now, when I did some work earlier on this year, I'm ever so mindful, Sylvia, that I'm a Black man, 6'2" tall, and people do have their own stories that they want to project onto you based on their own experience, right? And unfortunately, because of the compartmentalized society in which we have been raised, people typecast people, don't they? They stereotype people. And I often go into rooms where on the ticket of diversity, and they see this Black man come in, tall Black man come in, and you can see they're traumatized before I even open my mouth. Well, you know, what is he going to say? And then when I take this
how do you deal with that, Dr. Gifford?
Yeah, I just be myself, because I do take this pastoral approach. I just see myself as somebody who is challenged himself, somebody who is never perfect, somebody who has major issues himself, and I'm on the level with everyone else. And so when I came into IC24, into the boardroom, and shared, it was so powerful, because I was in a room of people who actually saw the need and wanting to actually do better with respect to inclusion. And I also I didn't see, as I did 2 weeks ago, people breathing or anything like that, you know, taking a sigh of relief. People were actually welcoming and generously excited about what what was going to happen. And I think this had a lot to do with what Andrew just said about the work that has already been done in the CRGs, for example, where people have already been talking vulnerably talking about certain challenges. And because of that sort of appetite being so wet, I came into a situation, into a context where, you know, I was just nudging things forward a bit, if that makes sense. So thank you for the work that you're already doing. And I sense that right now, IC24 is at that stage where you just want to take another lap now, go on to another lap. Yeah.